Hi everyone, welcome to our third lesson on PySense. Today we're going to cover PySense authentication and we're also going to cover PySense roles. So let's start with authentication. There are a couple of different ways to authenticate with your PySense client using PySense. The first way is you can authenticate by password. So you can see that we need the host, we need the username, we need the password, and we need which platform you're running PySense on, either Windows or Linux, because the PySense APIs are version specific. In addition to when you're authenticating by password or when you're authenticating by token, you also have these two optional parameters that you can add to this call, debug and verify. Debug is false by default. If you switch it to true, PySense, every time you make a REST API call, will print out a detailed log of what the API call was, what the URL it hit was, what the request payload was, and what the response payload was, along with some other information. If you set verify, verify here refers to SSL verification. So SSL verification is true by default. If you find that when you're trying to connect to your PySense server, you're running into SSL certification issues, you can set this to false in order to get PySense to not perform SSL verification on the API calls. So in addition to being able to authenticate by password, you can also authenticate by token. Again, we still need the host, and then we need this single bearer token. Now, when you log in to PySense with a username and password, what happens is PySense generates a token, which it then assigns to you, that PySense associates with the various permissions and objects that you own and can manipulate. So you can also just give your bearer token, if you happen to have it, directly to PySense. This could also be useful if you want to be able to run scripts as an admin, but you don't want to give the password to everyone. You could pass along the token instead. The recommended way for me to authenticate is you can just authenticate by files. There's a very handy method here that will go and read an authentication YAML file. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example YAML file. So at the top, we have a couple of required values. You need to have your host, which may need to include the port. It could be something like localhost :8081. It could be PySense.yourbusiness.com/whatever, etc. You also need your version, either Windows or Linux. And now here, you'll either need to provide your username and password, or you can provide a token. You should only provide one. And this allows you to authenticate by password or by token, again, through the config file. And then the config file, if you want to pass in parameters like debug and verify, you can pass them in here as well. These are optional and do not need to be included. So let's go ahead and jump back to authentication. So those are all the different ways we can authenticate. Let's take a minute to talk about PySense roles. So PySense has a couple of different roles. There's viewers, there's designers, there's data designers, there's admins, there's sysadmins. And a lot of those names are used differently by different clients or internally or externally. And even within the PySense product itself, there are different names for those roles. So in an attempt to kind of simplify things, we have a role enum. So here, if we want to get the role for viewer, if we want to get the viewer role, we can do PySense.role.from_, and then you can give it the string viewer. This method is meant to be very error tolerant, which is another advantage to using this. There are a lot of different checks that it can perform to see what the role is that you actually are looking for. And then, so you can see that if we wanted to say get the role ID for this role, here's what that would look like. We would say PySense.role.from_, let's get viewer, like we want the viewer role. So we're going to get, this now represents the viewer role. And we're going to say to our PySense client, our connection to PySense, we're going to say, hey, what is the role ID for this role? And it'll print it out. So I'm going to go ahead and run this code. I'll take a second here to comment out these lines because they are not going to work. And I'm going to replace that sample config with a link to my actual sample config. The advantage to using these config files is that you never really risk committing accidentally your passwords to any sort of public repo. It's a lot easier to kind of keep them separate and hidden. So that's the reason we recommend this method. So what we would expect here is we're going to authenticate by file. We're going to see that it's going to print out the viewer role 4 times. These are all different ways that we could have put in viewer, and we'll see that it's going to get us the same role every time. Then at the end, we're going to get the role ID for the viewer role that we're going to get, and we can actually verify that that's the correct role ID in PySense. So let's go ahead and give this a run. And you can see we got the role.viewer all 4 times. No matter what we put, it figured it out and figured out we actually wanted the viewer. And this is the role ID that is associated with viewer. So let's actually verify that. So let's go ahead and copy this. And I'm going to jump over to my PySense application. So here I have roles, return a role, username by role name. So I'm going to go ahead and paste this in. And now I'm going to execute this. And we can see what I get back is, in fact, the role. Its name is consumer, its display name is viewer. See how even within PySense there are different words for this. It contains all of this additional information, but you can see that we can verify that we are actually linked to our PySense environment. We are actually getting information in and out of it from Python. And it was, I think, very quick and easy. I hope you'll agree. And if you're interested in learning more, join us in the next lesson. Thank you.